We thought conquering Earth would be easy. We had crushed countless worlds before, reducing entire civilizations to dust. The humans had no fleet left, no defenses strong enough to stop us. Their world belonged to the Empire. Or so we believed. Then our soldiers began to disappear. Not in battle, not in retreat, just gone. The deeper we pushed into their cities, the less we understood. The war was over, yet the killing had only just begun. We were the invaders, but on Earth, we were the hunted. And before the last transmission fell silent, one truth became clear. You never fight human ground forces, because once you do, you never leave. The invasion of Earth was supposed to be routine. Our empire had subjugated countless worlds, each falling in the same predictable manner. Crushing orbital superiority, precision strikes to cripple infrastructure, and a final ground deployment to establish complete control. It was a formula perfected over centuries, an art of conquest so refined that resistance was rendered irrelevant before it even began. The humans would be no different. Our fleet arrived in their system like an unrelenting storm, blotting out the stars with our warships. Their orbital defenses crumbled within hours. A handful of desperate counterattacks flickered against our shields, but they were inconsequential. Scattered fleets, civilian ships hastily retrofitted for battle, all of them reduced to burning wreckage. Their planetary networks were jammed, communications severed, and as our battleships unleashed their opening bombardments, entire cities collapsed into dust. From the bridge of my command vessel, I watched it unfold with detached precision. The humans had built sprawling metropolises, vast stretches of interconnected infrastructure, but none of it could withstand the sheer force of our weapons. Fires spread unchecked. Skyscrapers crumbled under the weight of their own destruction. We had no need to glass the planet. We wanted it intact, its industries repurposed, its surviving population broken into servitude. Resistance would be expected, but futile. The order was given. Ground forces began deployment. Drop ships roared through the stratosphere, darkening the skies as they descended in waves. The plan was simple: secure the major cities, establish control zones, and systematically hunt down any remaining resistance. Our warriors, clad in armor impervious to human weaponry, marched with the confidence of an empire that had never known defeat. The first landings went unchallenged. Troops fanned out, establishing perimeters. The cities were eerily silent. Fires burned unattended. Streets were abandoned, and the air hung thick with the acrid stench of destruction. Yet there was no enemy. No desperate last stands, no civilians pleading for surrender. The few we found were already dead, killed not by our bombardment, but by something else. At first we assumed they had turned on each other in their panic. Perhaps their own defenses had misfired, or some biological weapon had backfired in their final moments of defiance. It did not matter. The result was the same. They had no army left to fight us. Victory was assured. I descended with the second wave, touching down on the outskirts of a human capital. Our landing zones stretched for miles, unbroken formations of soldiers and war machines moving with ruthless efficiency. Surveillance drones scoured the ruins ahead, mapping every block, scanning for heat signatures. The reports came back the same each time. No significant resistance detected. We advanced. The deeper we pushed into the city, the more unsettling it became. There were no bodies in the streets, no makeshift barricades, no sign that civilians had even attempted to flee. It was as if the population had simply vanished before we arrived. Then the first squad went missing. A standard patrol, 20 warriors moving in formation through the lower levels of a collapsed transit hub. They reported minor structural instability, then silence. No alarms, no weapon discharge, just silence. Attempts to contact them failed. Their tracking beacons, designed to function even in the most extreme conditions, showed nothing. They had simply ceased to exist. Another team was sent to investigate. They reported back. Empty corridors, no sign of struggle, weapons and gear left behind as if abandoned mid-step. Their last transmission was garbled, a burst of static and something else beneath it. Something almost like whispering. The second team never made it out. Panic was unacceptable. We were an empire forged in war, our legions trained to operate in the most hostile environments. We did not fear the unknown, and yet a cold unease had begun to settle over the ranks. Reinforcements were ordered. A full company moved into the district, deploying combat drones and motion scanners. The feeds flickered, then died. Soldiers vanished in groups now. Entire squads lost in the span of heartbeats. Those who remained reported strange noises in the distance, flickering shadows that should not have been there, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Orders were given to fall back and regroup, but retreat was no longer an option. The city that had seemed so lifeless now felt alive, its empty streets twisting into unseen traps, its structures swallowing us whole. We had expected a war. What we had found was something else entirely. The humans were still here, and they were waiting. The second wave landed under the assumption that the first had simply been too careless, too overconfident in their advance. Mistakes happen in warfare, even for an empire as refined as ours. A few lost squads did not change the outcome of the invasion. That was the reasoning behind High Command's orders. Deploy heavier forces, lock down the lost districts, and flush out whatever scattered resistance remained. Standard procedures were followed. Aerial reconnaissance swept the sector, heat and motion scans combed through the ruins, and armored transports deployed another wave of warriors, this time in overwhelming numbers. It was not a search and destroy mission, it was an occupation. We had already won the battle in orbit, and the ground would be no different. Or so we believed. The silence was the first thing that stood out. There was no enemy fire, no makeshift defenses, no panicked civilians fleeing for safety. The city itself seemed devoid of life, but there was something wrong, something beneath the surface of what our instruments could detect. Every sensor told us the sector was empty, but every warrior who stepped into those streets felt the same unease crawling under their skin. It was irrational, an emotion we had long been trained to suppress, yet it festered like a sickness in the ranks. Squads moved in disciplined formations, every step calculated, weapons primed, armor systems scanning for any sign of an enemy presence. It didn't matter. They began disappearing just the same. One moment, a soldier would be reporting their position, their voice steady and assured through the comms. The next, only silence remained. No gunfire, no warnings, no trace left behind. It happened in broad daylight, in open courtyards, on streets where escape should have been impossible. Drones captured nothing but empty spaces where entire units should have been standing. There were no battlefields, no corpses, no sign of struggle. Some of our forces managed to retreat from the black zones, but they did not return whole. They stumbled from the ruins in ones and twos, their armor intact, but their eyes vacant. Many would not speak. Some sat in silence, gripping their weapons so tightly that their fingers had to be pried away. Others whispered incoherently, fragments of broken speech that made no sense until they simply stopped responding altogether. Those who spoke made little sense of what had happened. They claimed they had seen nothing, heard nothing, just that something had been there. Something had taken them. More disturbing were the ones who did not resist. When approached by medics, they did not react. When questioned, they did not answer. When prodded, they sat motionless. It was only when left alone that they moved, slowly, unnaturally, as if responding to something unseen. One was recorded walking into an abandoned structure, their body moving without any discernible will, ignoring all commands to halt. They were never seen again. Panic spread through the ranks, an infection that could not be contained. Protocols were followed: consolidate forces, fortify key locations, reinforce perimeters. But the same truth repeated itself again and again. The more soldiers we deployed, the more soldiers we lost. Command ordered orbital surveillance to provide real-time imaging, a full scan of the city to track troop movements. What returned was impossible. Our warriors were where they had been assigned, but their signals flickered, some registering as miles away when they had never moved. And then came the first real proof that we were facing something beyond conventional war. One of our officers, desperate to uncover the source of these disappearances, had ordered a deep scan of the underground tunnels beneath the city. Human infrastructure was dense, layered with hidden pathways, maintenance corridors, and emergency shelters. It had been assumed that any resistance must have been using these tunnels to move unseen, to strike and retreat before we could locate them. The scan revealed something else. The tunnels were not abandoned, they were full. Hundreds of heat signatures, thousands, densely packed in formations that defied understanding. No movement, no sound, just bodies, waiting in absolute silence. The officer barely had time to relay the information before his signal was lost. His team was gone within minutes. Command issued a withdrawal order. The plan was clear. Cut our losses, pull back, regroup at the primary landing zones. But the retreat was not as simple as expected. The streets we had marched through hours before were no longer the same. Routes we had mapped were gone, replaced by crumbling ruins we did not recognize. Our vehicles failed, engines refusing to start, power systems inexplicably drained. The air itself felt heavier, as if the city itself was shifting against us. And then the first screams came. Not over comms, not through transmissions. From inside the city itself. It was the first time we had heard the enemy, and it was not the sound of battle. It was something else entirely, something that should not have been possible. Because the voices screaming for help were our own. The first scream sent a ripple through the remaining forces, a primal unease that even the most disciplined among us could not suppress. At first it was dismissed as interference, an anomaly in our audio channels. But then the voices became clearer, recognizable. They were our own. Our lost warriors, the ones who had vanished without explanation, were calling out from the ruins. Their voices echoed through the streets, through the broken corridors of abandoned structures, over the comms we thought had been long severed. They pleaded for help, begged for extraction, screamed in raw desperation. It should have been impossible. Every soldier was equipped with biometric tracking. If they were still alive, we would have known their exact locations. But the signals that should have identified them were absent, erased as if they had never existed. Some of our forces hesitated. We are not a species that abandons our own, not unless absolutely necessary. The instinct to recover our fallen, to reestablish control, pushed several squads deeper into the ruins. None returned. Then the voices changed. What had begun as panic distress calls warped into something else. The cadence of speech slowed. The words became strained as if unfamiliar tongues were struggling to recall the way they should sound. A warrior's voice would call out urgent, pleading only for another to echo it minutes later. The same words, but wrong. Twisted. Repeated phrases began to cycle over and over until they collapsed into broken static. Even those who had hardened themselves against fear began to shift uneasily. Our ranks, trained for the harshest combat in the galaxy, had never encountered an enemy that did not fight us directly. We had superior numbers, superior firepower. We controlled the skies, and yet we were being hunted. The reports continued to deteriorate. The enemy did not engage in open battle. They did not defend strongholds. Instead, they waited, observed, moved in ways that we could not predict. It was not warfare. It was something older, something more calculated. One unit attempted to track the source of the transmissions. They triangulated the strongest signal to a collapsed building, one of the structures that had been damaged in the initial bombardment. It was a simple task: send in a small squad to investigate, confirm the presence of survivors, extract if possible. The squad entered the ruins. What they found inside was documented in their armor feeds. It was the only footage that made it back to us before we lost them. The interior of the structure was covered in markings, not human symbols, not any known language, but patterns drawn in long, uneven strokes along the walls and floors. Our scanners struggled to analyze them, flickering with errors and distorted readouts. The squad pressed deeper inside, weapons raised, their movements measured. Then they saw it. A soldier. One of ours. He stood in the center of the ruined space, motionless. His armor was intact, but something was wrong. His stance was rigid, his head slightly tilted. He did not respond to hails, did not react as his squad cautiously approached. His vital readings, if he was alive, were absent. Then he moved. Not a normal movement. His limbs jerked forward as if pulled by unseen strings, his head snapping toward them at an unnatural angle. The feed began to distort, as if something was interfering with the transmission. And then, just before the video cut out, the last thing recorded was the soldier's visor reflecting something behind them. Something standing in the dark. The squad was lost. The moment their signal vanished, the voices began again, this time speaking with their words, repeating their last transmissions, echoing their fear back at us. We tried to regroup, to consolidate what remained of our forces, but cohesion was crumbling. Soldiers began refusing to patrol past certain boundaries. Others abandoned their posts, choosing instead to move in groups so large they became easy targets. Some simply stopped speaking altogether, their minds consumed by the growing weight of dread. Command attempted to regain control. Orders were issued for total lockdown, fortify positions, halt advances, abandon non-essential zones. The plan was simple: hold until reinforcements arrived. Reinforcements never came. Our fleet, the massive force that had secured our victory in orbit, had gone silent. No orders. No updates. No response. The ships that had loomed overhead like gods of war had simply ceased transmitting. And then, the final proof that this war was no longer ours to win arrived. From the heart of the ruins, new movement was detected. Not scattered resistance. Not isolated humans fighting a lost battle. A coordinated force. Emerging all at once. They had not been hiding. They had been waiting. And now the hunt had truly begun. The illusion of control had shattered. The disciplined ranks of our invasion force, once an unstoppable tide, had fractured into isolated pockets of survivors, desperately clinging to whatever ground they still held. The realization had settled in like a sickness. We were no longer the invaders. We were the prey. Our weapons had proven useless against an enemy that did not fight conventionally. There had been no grand counterattack, no final stand. The humans had never sought to meet us head-on. Instead, they had simply let us come, let us march deeper into their world, let us think we had already won. The remaining command elements had no choice but to enact a full retreat. Every available dropship was recalled to extract what forces could be salvaged. Fortified positions were abandoned, strongholds left to decay. The only goal now was escape. But escape was no longer a guarantee. The skies above us, once filled with our warships, had become a silent graveyard. The fleet that had secured our victory, that had annihilated Earth's defenses, was gone. No distress calls. No debris falling from orbit. No wreckage to suggest they had been destroyed in battle. Just gone. As if they had never been there at all. At first we believed it was a malfunction in long-range communications. Then we tried to send up recon craft to visually confirm what had happened. None of them returned. One by one they launched into the sky, ascending toward the stars where our fleet had once been, and then their signals simply ceased. No impact. No transmissions. Nothing. Something was keeping us here. Our extraction zones turned into death traps. Dropships descended through the atmosphere, their engines burning bright as they came to retrieve us, only for their pilots to report strange anomalies, glitches in their navigation, sensor failures, sudden course corrections that they had not initiated. Some never even made it to the surface. They would be seen descending toward us, visible against the smoke-choked sky, only for them to flicker out of existence mid-flight. No explosion. No wreckage. Just gone. The ones that did land suffered worse fates. Survivors who managed to reach the extraction points, who had fought through the empty streets and the whispering ruins to reach salvation, were met with nothing but horror. Dropship crews were found slumped in their seats, their bodies intact but their eyes staring blankly, lifeless. Their ships were still functional, still fully operational, yet no one who stepped inside ever came out again. One desperate group attempted to manually pilot one of the ships off-world, overriding all safety protocols and launching despite the ominous warnings. Their comms remained active long enough to transmit one final message. Not a distress call. Not a plea for help. Laughter. A broken, unnatural laughter that did not belong to any of them. After that, no one attempted to board the dropships again. We had thought the city was empty when we arrived. That had been the greatest deception of all. The humans had never left. They had never needed to. They had simply let us take step after step into a place we had never truly understood. They did not engage us because they did not have to. They did not fight us because they had already won before the first shot was fired. And now they were letting us feel what it meant to be powerless. Time no longer felt the same. The days and nights blurred into one endless stretch of waiting for an attack that never came, waiting for an escape that would never arrive, waiting for something unseen to decide it was time for us to vanish like all the others. Some of us stopped waiting. There were reports of soldiers walking away from their posts, stripping off their armor and stepping into the ruins without a word. No one tried to stop them. No one knew if it would have mattered. Some still clung to the illusion of resistance, barricading themselves inside whatever structure still stood, hoarding weapons that had long since proven ineffective. But there was no enemy to fight. No battle left to win. One by one, the last pockets of our forces fell silent. Not in combat. Not in surrender. Just silent. And then, at last, the transmissions began again. Not ours. Theirs. The transmission started as whispers, faint signals crackling through the remnants of our communication networks, barely distinguishable from the background static. At first we thought it was more of the interference that had plagued us since the moment things began to unravel. But as the sounds became clearer, as the voices sharpened into something recognizable, the truth set in like ice through our veins. They were our own transmissions, not the enemy's, not some unknown signal. They were ours, our own voices, our own reports, our own desperate attempts at coordination, played back to us in perfect replication. Except they were wrong. Time-stamped messages that had been sent days ago now returned to us, distorted, altered. Orders given by long-lost officers were repeated, but the phrasing had shifted ever so slightly. The voices sounded almost correct, but not entirely. Some syllables dragged too long. Some words were spoken too quickly. And then there were the moments where they simply stopped, mid-sentence, as if whoever or whatever was speaking had momentarily forgotten how language was supposed to work. Some of us tried to ignore them. We were trained for deception, for psychological warfare. We had been briefed before deployment on the possibility of misinformation tactics, of enemy strategies designed to break morale. But this was something else. Because the voices kept adapting. We listened to reports we had never made, conversations we had never had, entire exchanges between soldiers that never took place. Yet they carried our tones, our inflections, our urgency, as if the enemy had been listening, learning, trying to become us. Then the transmissions became personal. Soldiers heard their own voices calling for help, heard themselves screaming over the comms, using words they had never spoken. Some were so shaken that they abandoned their posts, desperately seeking the sources of the voices only to disappear into the ruins, like all the others before them. One by one, the last organized groups dissolved. What few remained, those who had not succumbed to the madness, those who still believed escape was possible, banded together in silence. We abandoned comms entirely. No more transmissions. No more desperate calls for help. We communicated only through gestures, through written orders scratched into the walls. It didn't matter. The voices didn't stop. They no longer needed our transmissions. They were us now. In the final hours, the last remnants of our force retreated to a single structure, one of the few still standing, a reinforced administrative building that had somehow remained untouched by the destruction around it. We sealed the doors, barricaded every entrance, powered down every non-essential system. There were barely a few dozen of us left, huddled together in the dark. No one spoke. No one dared. Outside, the city was silent. No movement. No sign of the enemy. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. And the voices began again. Not over comms this time. From inside the room. They started as murmurs, hushed conversations, as if whispered from just beyond the range of our hearing. Then they grew louder. Clearer. Closer. They were speaking from the corners of the room, from the empty spaces between us. The voices of our fallen comrades, calling our names, repeating orders we had given, replaying moments from our past, as if rehearsing what it meant to be us. Some broke then. It was too much. One soldier turned on his weapon, opened fire at nothing. His shots tore through the dark, lighting up the room in brief flashes. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Then he froze. His body went rigid, his weapon falling from his grip. His breathing hitched, stuttered. Then, slowly, he began to speak. But the words were not his own. His voice, his tone, but not his will. And one by one, we understood the final truth of this place. We had never been fighting an army. We had been fighting the city itself. The realization came as a crushing weight, an awful, silent understanding that spread through the remaining survivors like a disease. It wasn't just the humans we had been hunting that were lost. It wasn't even the war itself that had been doomed from the start. We had never stood a chance. The city, the very fabric of this world, had turned against us. The humans hadn't been the enemies we were fighting. The city had been the real threat all along. The structure we had taken refuge in was no sanctuary. It had been a trap, just as the rest of the city had been. We were no different from the soldiers who had walked in before us, hoping to find safety only to disappear into the dark, to become part of something far older and more insidious than we could comprehend. The voices, once distant, were now all around us. Every corner of the room echoed with whispers that sounded like our own. The walls seemed to hum, vibrating with a rhythm that wasn't natural. It was as though the building itself was alive, as if every floorboard, every beam, every brick had been waiting for us to make the mistake of stepping inside. None of us spoke. We couldn't. Words seemed pointless now. All that remained was the sound of our breath, shallow and quick, as we listened to the slow creak of the building's bones. Then the walls began to change. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the angles, a faint warping of the surface. But as the minutes stretched on, we saw the truth. The walls weren't just changing, they were growing. The once sterile industrial structure now felt organic, like it was shifting, breathing in time with our fear. The markings that had covered the streets, the patterns we had seen scrawled on the ruins, began to appear on the walls, curling around the edges like tendrils. They seemed to pulse, to move, to rewrite themselves, growing more intricate, more complex with every passing moment. Some of us tried to escape. They ran for the doors, pounding on them, screaming for them to open, but the door frames had sealed shut. The locks turned in on themselves no matter how hard we pulled. The windows were no better. When we tried to break the glass, the surface was solid, unyielding, like an invisible force field pushing back against us. It was as though we were locked inside a cage, and the city was holding the key. Desperation took hold of those who still had the strength to fight. A few tried to turn their weapons on the walls, firing at the growing tendrils, but the rounds ricocheted off as though they had struck solid metal. The walls didn't even flinch. They just continued to grow. And all the while, the voices called out to us. They were no longer distinct. They had merged into one chorus, a cacophony of whispers and screams and pleas that layered over one another, an unending tide of human voices. At first, it was the voices of the fallen soldiers, the ones who had vanished without a trace. Then it was our own voices, distorted, hollow, twisted in ways we couldn't understand. The words they spoke were not their own. They were us, or at least a reflection of who we were, a broken mirror of every soldier who had walked these streets, of every officer who had tried to hold it together. I heard my own name repeated, calling me from the darkness. Others began to weep. Others screamed. Some sat in silent terror, their eyes wide and unblinking, unable to look away from the walls as they warped and grew, as the city continued its slow, inexorable crawl toward something we could not grasp. I don't know how long it lasted. Time was meaningless by then. Every second bled into the next, each one as indistinguishable from the other as the last. We were trapped in this space, in this place, locked in a world where nothing obeyed the rules we had come to know. There was no escape. No hope. I think some of us had stopped trying. The ones who still had enough mind left to resist would stand, face the walls and watch the patterns writhe like living creatures. I could see it in their eyes. They knew what we had all become. There was no salvation, no way out. We had become part of the city's story, another chapter in its endless, shifting narrative. And that was when it happened. The final revelation. The walls stopped shifting. The building was still. The whispers died down, fading into the silence that felt more suffocating than the cacophony ever had. The last remnants of our force stood still, waiting for the end to come. But it never did. Instead, the walls opened. A single crack appeared, slowly widening, revealing what was beyond. It wasn't another room, another escape route. It was a portal, a gateway to something far darker, far older. We had known from the start that we had stepped into something we couldn't understand, but now we saw it in its full, terrible form. The city wasn't just a place. It was a prison. And we were its latest prisoners. The whispers returned, not from the walls, but from the void beyond the portal. And this time they were not mocking us. They were welcoming us home. The portal loomed before us, its edges ragged, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn open. Whatever lay beyond it was incomprehensible. A darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity, as if the universe itself had folded in on itself at this very spot. The air around the rift shimmered, distorting the space around it like the air over a fire. And through that distortion I could see flashes, shapes, movement, something shifting, something watching. The very atmosphere hummed with an unsettling energy, as if the city, the place we had thought to conquer, had been merely the surface of something far deeper and more ancient than we had ever realized. Some of us, the last few soldiers who had managed to hold on to any semblance of their sanity, stood frozen. We knew that whatever lay beyond the portal was not something we could fight. There would be no weapons, no tactics, no plans that would make any difference here. We were not entering a battle. We were being drawn into something else, something that had been waiting long before we had ever set foot on this planet, long before the war even began. For a few moments, no one moved. The weight of the silence pressed in on us, the quiet more oppressive than any battlefield. Then the first soldier broke free from his trance. With a shuddering breath, he stepped forward toward the rift, as if drawn by an invisible force, a compulsion stronger than any fear, stronger than any reason. The others, myself included, watched in morbid fascination as he walked closer to the portal, his feet dragging with each step, as though the ground beneath him had grown heavier with every inch. He reached the threshold, and for the briefest moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just that sickening feeling of time slowing down. I saw his face, a mask of both fear and curiosity, the same expression we all shared. Then, the silence shattered. The soldier's body spasmed violently, his arms and legs jerking in ways that defied logic, that defied the very rules of biology. He let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a howl of pure inhuman terror, as if something inside him was being torn apart, ripped open by forces beyond comprehension. His body twisted, stretched unnaturally, and then just as quickly as it had begun, the sound stopped. He collapsed, crumpling to the ground, a broken shell of a man. His eyes were wide open, unseeing, yet somehow aware of a terrible truth that no one could unlearn. He didn't move again. The rest of us stood there, transfixed, too afraid to look away, too terrified to step forward. But we knew. Deep down we knew that his fate was not unique. The portal had claimed him, as it would claim all of us in time. This was not an escape. It was a descent, a final reckoning. This was the end of our mission, the end of our existence as soldiers, as invaders, as conquerors. And yet, something inside me, the last shred of stubborn will that had survived the horror of everything we had witnessed, refused to let it end this way. I couldn't accept it. Not like this. We had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to simply let this place consume us without resistance. I moved forward. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but I walked. I had no plan, no strategy. I had nothing left but my survival instinct, and something more, something buried deep within that I had never truly understood until that moment. The others, still standing, watched me in silence. There were no words of encouragement, no rallying cries. They were too far gone to hope. But I knew. I knew that if we were to die, it would not be because we had surrendered. It would not be because we had simply given in to the darkness. We would die fighting, if nothing else. As I stepped closer to the portal, the air seemed to press against me, a thick, viscous force, like being submerged in water. The temperature dropped. I felt a chill in my bones, something that wasn't cold but unnatural, something that froze my very soul. But I didn't stop. I was close now, so close that I could feel the pulse of the thing beyond the rift. It was alive, not in the sense of an organism, but alive in a way that defied comprehension. It was watching us, waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that it had been waiting for us all along. I stepped through. The world fell away. There was no floor, no sky, no air. I felt myself falling, though there was nothing to fall through. My senses, sight, sound, touch disintegrated, leaving me in a void that was neither dark nor light, neither cold nor warm. It simply was. Then something shifted. A presence. Not a being, not a creature, but something older, something that had always existed, lurking in the spaces between everything. It spoke. Not in words, not in language, but in thoughts and impressions and sensations that burned themselves into my mind. You are here because you must be. You are here because you cannot leave. You are part of us now. You always were. And just like that, I understood. The city had not been the enemy. The city was a prison, yes, but it was also a gateway. A gateway to something far older. Something we could never comprehend. The rift, the voices, the endless whispers, they were part of the cycle. We were the latest iteration in a long, endless line of conquerors, of invaders who had come and fallen all the same. And now we would join them. As the presence enveloped me, I no longer fought. There was nothing left to fight. The last thought that crossed my mind was not fear, but resignation. We were part of the story now. The final story. As the last echoes of this story fade into the void, remember one thing: the universe has its own way of dealing with invaders, and sometimes the greatest enemy is not the one you face, but the world you're trying to conquer. If you've enjoyed this wild ride through the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Who knows what's waiting beyond the next horizon? Stay tuned, because the story doesn't end here.